deciding what story to tell about Al-Nuri Mosque, or what story to tell about Palmyra or about the Buddhas of Banyan, is a question that is not determined technically, but determined culturally and ultimately politically. Let me take another example, which you're definitely familiar with because it was shown live on television all around the world. In 2019, the Cathedral of Notre Dame suffered a very serious fire. And of course, the question is how to rebuild. And this question is a tricky one because, as with Al-Nuri Mosque, the state of Notre Dame immediately before it burnt down is historically questionable. In particular, and I'm sure many of you saw this on television, the spire in the center of the cathedral, above the main nave, which collapsed during the fire, was a 19th century addition. It was not part of the historical building. It's not medieval. It was built in the 1840s by the somewhat eccentric neo-Gothic architect Viollet-le-Duc, who thought it would make a great addition to a medieval building that he was passionate about and that many people at the time were not hugely interested in. So do you rebuild the spire or not? Do you reestablish Notre Dame as it was immediately before the fire? Or rather, sorry, I just asked for 1 second of your time. I'll be back in 1 second. There's a local. Please accept my apologies. Sorry, there was a local problem I had to deal with. So how do you rebuild Notre Dame? And the question how to rebuild is, of course, again, not a technical question. You can rebuild exactly what was present in, say, February 2019, or make the choice to do something else in a different way. In other words, depending on the meaning ascribed to the rubble, you can rebuild or precisely not rebuild. And of course, in the case of UNESCO, in the case of the rubble of 1945, the decision was not to rebuild what had been destroyed, but precisely to clear away the rubble and rebuild something different. And in many cases, that is the task with which we are confronted. And it resembles in many ways the task that we need to deal with now. The rubble of 1945 is well known, and I think its meaning can be summarized very simply from two key phrases in UNESCO's constitution. The two key phrases are the defenses of peace in the minds of men, what it was desired to build, and not something that pre-existed, but something that needed to be built anew in the time, and the intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind. Again, a quote from the Constitution. The first point, the defenses of peace in the minds of men, is, of course, as you all know, a very clear criticism of the legal institutional framework of the League of Nations, of the idea of outlawing war, as written into the Briand-Kellogg Pact of 1927, by the affirmation of the fact that peace is not simply a diplomatic circumstance. It's not the mere suspension of hostilities, something that Hobbes already said very clearly in the Leviathan in 1651. It is, as Hobbes puts it, not mere absence of fighting, but the absence of the known disposition thereto. The disposition to fight, which Hobbes regards as the state of war in the Leviathan, is precisely what UNESCO's constitution defines as the opposite of the defenses of peace in the minds of men. The Westphalian order, which in some ways Hobbes was one of the first theorists of, contemporaneously with its emergence, the treaties of Westphalia were signed in 1648, 1649, and Leviathan was published in its first edition in 1651, were an attempt to create the conditions of peace as a structural condition based on certain principles governing the relations between states. It had become clear by the time of the First World War that those arrangements between states were not sufficient to create the conditions for peace if the known disposition to fight in the minds of men was not itself addressed. The League of Nations tried and failed to do that. The world system created in 1945 was designed to address in a new way, not simply through diplomatic balance, but also through education, science, and culture, and international cooperation in the realm of trade and of health, and of labor regulations and many other things. UNESCO is just one part of a much bigger UN system to try to create the conditions where peace could be more than mere suspension of hostilities. And the intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind refers very clearly to a judgment about what happened, particularly in the 1930s, when art, science, literature, and so on were politically distorted in ways that were considered by the founding the founding members of the UN system as a kind of a crime, both against the nature of knowledge and against the human spirit. In particular, the idea that science should be fragmented into racial science or proletarian science or whatever was considered incompatible with the idea of the scientific enterprise as representing something about not just the intellectual solidarity of humankind, but also its moral solidarity. So that the efforts undertaken in the 40s and early 50s to rebuild the institutions of international scientific cooperation were efforts not just to create a basis for science diplomacy, but also to propound, popularize, and make visible a vision of the nature of science as it relates to the moral solidarity of humankind. Of course, once the rubble of 1945 had been cleared, the construction of this system, which was never a simple reconstruction, was in turn modified by a number of new factors which emerged in the early period of the UN system and which led the life of UNESCO in particular, but it's true of many parts of the United Nations, to be defined in its formative years, not just by the response to the Second World War, but equally importantly, by the management of the Cold War and the management of the process of decolonization, which was an aspect of the Cold War, but not limited to it. And in many ways, the whole life of UNESCO, from its birth until the first major structural crisis of the organization in 1984, was defined by the Cold War and decolonization as structural processes transforming global geopolitics, but also fundamentally transforming the geography of the defenses of peace in the minds of men and the geography of the intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind. Hence the historical investment of UNESCO on questions such as racism, for instance, with the two major conferences of 1952 and 1967, which in many ways represent the pinnacles of UNESCO's influence on agendas in the social and human sciences since the creation of the organization. Clearly, the parameters of UNESCO's birth and history no longer apply in the same way or in the same form. That doesn't mean they're no longer relevant, but it does mean that if they are relevant, their relevance has to be defined by reference to circumstances that prevail now, not simply by the successful achievement of certain missions defined in 1945, or by the continuing importance at an abstract level of the values of defending peace in the minds of men, or promoting the intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind. After all, even if you subscribe to both of those values, and there are very strong reasons to do so, maybe the mechanisms for realizing them need to be very different in a world that has different structural parameters than those of 1945 or even those of, say, 1975. This is a legitimate discussion. It's a constant discussion, obviously, both within the Secretariat and in the governing bodies of the organization. The notion of rubble is helpful, I think, in sharpening that question about the circumstances within which we find ourselves today. What is the rubble with which we are confronted in 2020? Which means basically three questions, the three I asked earlier, to which I will add a fourth, which in some ways is the most troubling. The first question, what is now destroyed and needs to be cleared to make space for the future? This was probably pretty obvious in 1945. It's maybe less obvious today. Still, we have to ask the question, are there things that need to be cleared away to make space? Secondly, what does that rubble mean? Once we've identified it as rubble and defined it as something to be cleared to make space for new building operations, what meaning do we give to what we have cleared away? That includes the very technical question, which architects and civil engineers ask regularly, how much of the rubble can we use for the rebuilding? As you know, post-imperial Rome was very largely built from the rubble of imperial Rome in ways that archaeologists continue to make interesting discoveries about. And of course, if you were living in Rome in the Middle Ages, then it was very tempting to use the vast reservoirs of stone in the ancient buildings to build whatever you needed to build in your own time. This recycling of physical materials is part of the life of a city for very obvious reasons. And in some ways, it anticipates the idea of a circular economy, which many people put at the heart of the kind of environmental approach that we need today. Of course, it also means that old things get destroyed, but maybe sometimes old things do need to be destroyed to make space for the new. But some rubble doesn't get reused, maybe because it's toxic, maybe because it's unusable, maybe because it carries symbols that we do not wish to be associated with whatever we are trying to build today. These questions of interpretation are at the heart of any approach to rubble. We need to be civil engineers, but we also need to be archaeologists, artists, literary scholars, imaginative interpreters of the past with which we are confronted. Third, among the things that have been damaged by the passage of time and by the changes of circumstance, what do we need to preserve? Not everything that is fragile should be demolished and cleared away to make space. Sometimes when things are fragile, on the contrary, we devote resources to keeping them in their current state, perhaps even restoring them. But the decision to keep something as it is or to restore it is obviously premised on giving it some permanent value, which means a conversation on the criteria for that permanent value. It's not obvious. You can't just point at something in a technical sense and say, that will fall down if we don't restore it. Then what? Should we restore it? Depends. You can, but you don't have to. And the fourth question, perhaps the most troubling, is whether there are things we need deliberately to destroy in order to make space for the new. Do we need to make rubble and not simply identify it? Most of human history has involved, to some extent, at certain crucial junctures, which have often been called either in their own time or by later historians revolutions, deliberately destroying things, ideas, monuments, structures, institutions, in order to make space for the new. The French revolutionaries of the 1790s, as you all know very well, took this to an extreme extent in the idea that by destroying essentially everything, they would guarantee the emergence of a new world. For instance, as is well known, completely destroying old systems of measurement to make space for a new, rational, uniform system of measurement based not on human activity, but on fundamental properties of the universe. There's been some very interesting literature on the invention of the meter, for instance. how the meter was conceived as a concept and how the meter was standardized as a unit of measurement, was a genuinely revolutionary enterprise undertaken by self-conscious revolutionaries from 1793 to 1798, which involved, among other things, a new estimate of the circumference of the Earth, which was an astonishing and fascinating enterprise to conduct at a time of social upheaval and war. It was nonetheless done, as you know, successfully, and literally changed the world by developing, again, not just a new unit of measure, but a new understanding of what it was to measure length. And of course, similar things applied to time and to volume and to area and to other aspects of our physical measurement systems. Those four questions: what is destroyed and needs to be cleared? What does that rubble mean? What, if anything, do we need to preserve? And is there anything we should deliberately destroy to make space? Are ultimately the questions that any time needs to ask itself in terms of its understanding of where it stands and where it might go. You will note that these resemble questions about what the future might bring, but in a slightly different form. They're not about the future, they're about the present and the past. They are recognizing the fact that the future is not so much something to be claimed, something to be analyzed, something to be discovered, as something that will emerge more or less deliberately from the consequences of what we do to try to bring it about. And of course, UNESCO, as you probably know, has a lot of investment in this idea of the future as something that almost by definition doesn't exist yet. I won't go into details on that. Time is too short. But what is important for present purposes is that none of those four questions are mere technical questions that can be answered unambiguously by reference to the best available knowledge. Of course, you can consult experts. You can do a conference, you can write a book. But there is an irreducible dimension of normative judgment and interpretation, which goes beyond the technical knowledge on which the judgment can be based. In other words, all of these questions are spaces of political choice. Political in the most general and noble sense of the word. How exactly the political choices might be made is a different question. I am a political scientist by training, but I don't propose here to be discussing the question of which political institutions should shape our futures. We can keep that for the discussion part of this presentation. Furthermore, and this is sort of the end of the beginning of my presentation, even though I'm more than halfway through, I think it's important to emphasize, given the time at which I am making this presentation, given the circumstances in which I'm making it, a Congress that has gone virtual in response to the pressure of events, the questions I was asking are not primarily or specifically about the current pandemic, even though there is a fashion to say that we should be rethinking the world in response to the pandemic or rethinking the world after the pandemic. In my analysis, at least, the pandemic is much more of a symptom than an event. Very little of what is genuinely new in the face of the pandemic is really that new. And I'm not going to give you a whole bibliographical analysis, but let me just point to some questions which are heightened and sharpened by the pandemic, but are actually not very new at all. Questions about manufactured risk. And zoonotic pandemics are the ultimate in manufactured risk, a consequence of the way in which we relate to nature. Related questions about bio-environmental interfaces and the emergence of new patterns, such as viral mutations. Questions about the tendency of systemic trends, such as supply chain globalization, to undermine the conditions of their own sustainability. Questions about the tensions between abstract solidarity, which in some ways is stronger in our societies than it has ever been. Call it sentimentalism if you don't like it. But one of the striking aspects of this pandemic has been the genuine desire to make every life count, perhaps more than in any epidemic exercise that humanity has ever encountered. And at the same time, the erosion of the concrete institutions that make solidarity work within particular societies, or even more so globally. Questions about the fragmentation and diversification of life paths and identities. Questions about the control of technology. Questions about the connection between demography and social change. All of these questions are very important. All of them are relevant to how we make sense of the pandemic. None of them is new. Just taking the 1990s as a reference point, we could do a whole seminar about the thought of people like Ulrich Beck, Anthony Giddens, David Harvey, Bruno Latour, all of whom were writing 25 years ago about exactly these questions, and all of whom are relevant to mobilize, sometimes in new ways, sometimes in ways that they themselves were already very explicit about in the face of current circumstances. So the problem is less that we're faced with new challenges or problems in some abstract technical sense, than that we are faced with a sudden shift in our vocabulary, in our mindset. We need a new language to make sense of these questions because we are confronted with them in a way that is fundamentally different from the somewhat forward-looking, abstract, rather theoretical way in which these questions have been asked in the past. Not for the first time, of course. You could say that the events of September 2001 or the financial tensions of the world system that have been identified years before by academic specialists. But of course, the pandemic does this in a much more uniform and global and dramatized way, and also does so in a way that is very interesting, I think, for the kind of discussion we need to have here, and which, to a considerable extent, we started to have already in the event organized on Tuesday in the context of the MOST program, which is that we have a pandemic which is both an unquestioned emergency and an emergency that unfolds in slow motion. It's not like a volcano exploding or a meteorite strike, a tsunami, something that unfolds over a few hours and then leaves the consequences to be dealt with as best we can. This is something unfolding over months, not years, unlike climate change, months, long enough for us to be forced to think about it as it is happening, and short enough for it to be a genuine, unquestionable emergency. That's rather unusual, and it creates a time of thinking that is potentially very productive. Again, not because the pandemic itself raises radically new questions, but because it embeds in everyday life. It makes urgent questions that previously might have seemed somewhat abstract and theoretical. So, with a view not so much concluding as to kickstarting some discussion, let me give you some very indicative answers to my 4 questions. What do we need to clear away? What is rubble? What is dead and needs to be buried? And I think the answer to this is mainly in the area of ideas. And this is troubling for the UN system because it goes to the heart of what we think our current identity is. What is dead and needs to be buried is the post-Washington consensus. As it emerged after the first phase of post-Cold War financial integration, after the first crises of structural adjustments in the mid-1990s, as a response to the need to build a world that was more inclusive and integrated and less dominated by a purely financial approach to issues and more sensitive in particular to challenges of trade and technological development. That post-Washington consensus effectively is the Millennium Project as adopted by the UN in 2000. It is the spirit of the Millennium Development Goals as adopted in 2000. It is the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals as basically the unfinished business of the Millennium Development Goals. What I'm saying, in other words, is that we are, as the UN system, but not just the UN system, effectively still trying to complete the unfinished business of 1995. This isn't uncommon. The European Union has the same issues. The European Union is effectively trying to complete the unfinished business of Maastricht, even though the world in which the Maastricht Treaty was adopted in 1992 has vanished, never to return. And the attempt to use the ideas of the day before yesterday to solve yesterday's problems, unsurprisingly, doesn't produce very effective results. What does this mean for an organization that is part of a UN system which has defined itself by the achievement of the 2030 agenda? And of course, when I say UN system, I'm not referring just to the secretariats of the UN or its specialized agencies. Every state in the world is a member, a stakeholder in that UN system, and needs to ask itself the same question. At what point do we say it's time to close that particular agenda and move on? The point being, not that the goals that the 2030 agenda is trying to achieve have somehow become obsolete. Of course, extreme poverty is a scandal. Of course, the oceans need to be protected. Of course, gender equality is a desirable goal to aim for. Of course, universal education is a good thing. The problem is the theory of change connected to those goals that tries to make them an action agenda. And that theory of change was based on certain assumptions about the beneficial patterns of globalization, the beneficial trickle down of technological progress, and the emergence of a less divided world, better unified by a combination of traditional multilateralism and new forms of governmentalism, of which the G20 is perhaps exemplary. And it's that part that demonstrably isn't working, and perhaps cannot work in its own terms. We need to rethink, in other words, not just the values, and perhaps not primarily the values, but the mechanisms on the basis of which we collectively, as the world, the kind of we that's often used in this kind of context, so of course it's a very divided we that not everyone signs up to, the mechanisms we need to rethink. It is far from clear, and the pandemic has sharpened this perspective very clearly, the questions around climate change also, that there is an incremental path to achieve the objectives we are committed to within the institutions that gave rise to the problems in the first place. Institutions are not good at incremental change. I'll come back to this in a moment. Sometimes the only way to produce change is to get rid of the institutions and build new ones. Of course, there is a politics of this as well. And the politics is both extremely interesting for anyone like me who's a political scientist by training, and often very worrying for anyone who subscribes to a value-driven vision of the global system. Because the politics of what's often called populism, let's keep it as a label, even though I'm not sure it works very well as a concept, are precisely the sign in the real politics of countries around the world that this incremental, technocratic, globalization-driven process of gradual improvement towards the realization of universally shared values, first, doesn't work as a process, and second, doesn't command universal, or in many places, even majority support. The assumption that no one could object to the values that the 2030 agenda is trying to achieve is an assumption we have to dispense with. Many people do object, either to the values as such, or to the preconditions for their achievement, the kinds of reforms and changes necessary to make them happen. And the connection of political populism with the rejection of science, as seen in many areas, from climate change to this pandemic itself, are a sign of how deep the problem goes. It goes to the heart, ultimately, of, to quote UNESCO's constitution once again, the intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind. Populism is, among other things, a very visible breakdown of that intellectual and moral solidarity, combined with a rejection of the principle of intellectual and moral solidarity. Now, of course, it's easy to exaggerate this tendency. And if you track social media, you will see the most hysterical expressions of the objections and will therefore probably overestimate their importance. But still, there are real world phenomena that correspond to those social media explosions, and it would be unwise not to take them seriously. Secondly, what does that rubble mean? If it's true that we are still trying desperately to keep alive an ideological configuration that is definitively obsolete, what should we conclude from it? And I think a simple way of putting it is in terms, and here this comes directly from our discussion on Tuesday, which made me think very productively. So thank you for the opportunity to do so. From the combination of three big ideas from the 1990s that were enormously influential in that time, particularly among people who read only the summaries, not the books. These are the ideas of soft power, of the end of history, and of the clash of civilizations. Joseph Nye, Francis Fukuyama, and Samuel Huntington, respectively, said things that were more subtle, more nuanced, and much more interesting than the ways in which their slogans have penetrated public debate. But the post-Washington consensus or the Millennium consensus or whatever else you want to call it is in a sense the confluence of those three ideas. The idea that we have left behind us a certain mode of international politics, which has created a space for technocratic management of globalization through means that were based on some combination of the use of soft power, the recognition of the end of fundamental ideological oppositions, and the need to manage the risks of cultural rejection of globalization. Fukuyama, Nye, and Huntington weren't saying the same things. In fact, Huntington was consciously writing against Fukuyama. But the point is that those ideas converged in a diagnosis and in a project. And the project was basically the view that the only limits to globalization were cultural, and that overcoming the cultural limits to globalization was the essence of the Millennium Project. It hasn't worked. But the reasons why it hasn't worked have to be taken seriously as problems with the underlying framework. The simplistic understanding of technology as something that would simply unfold and produce benefits, as if technology didn't raise questions about its relation to human values, to the social organization of employment, to control and distribution of rent, and to geopolitical rivalries around those technologies. It was also a configuration that was insufficiently attentive to environmental issues, even though the Rio Conference in 1992 set the terms of reference for current environmental concerns. It didn't really do anything about them for a very long time. And the assumption was that environmental problems would take care of themselves on condition that technology-driven globalization worked in a reasonably inclusive and progressive way. That rubble points to our blind spots, points to the need to a fundamentally new understanding of those processes, for which the pandemic offers an excellent opportunity. The pandemic has reminded us, among other things, that it was never true to regard the state as a locus of institutional authority as having been hollowed out by globalization. The state was maybe hollowed out by globalization in terms of its legitimacy, but not in terms of its action capacity. La preuve, as one says in French, the ability of states, even states that would not necessarily be regarded as strong states, Greece, Senegal, to respond in surprisingly assertive and effective ways to the public health crisis, including placing restrictions and constraints on the movement of their citizens that would have been considered unimaginable and probably impossible to implement by states such as those. Again, look at how Greece managed the pandemic, and revisit some stereotypes about the weakness of the Greek state. Now, of course, there's a political sociology of some interesting writing about how the financial crisis prepared the conditions for Greece to deal effectively, at least in a narrow sense, with the pandemic. And there's some very interesting discussions there. I won't go into them. But what is striking is that that assumption, we can drop it. It was never true. And it has been shown live not to be true. What do we do with that? That's a different question. What do we preserve, given that some things have collapsed and do not deserve to be rescued? That doesn't mean everything deserves to be cleared away. But the question what to preserve is not a technical question, it's a normative question. And it's not clear whether we have the kind of basis for a consensus on founding values that existed in the circumstances of 1945, when the victors of the war against fascism could agree on a small number of very important things, at least for a while. It's not clear that there's any similar kind of agreement that would allow a new consensus to emerge, underwriting the things to be preserved in ways that will guarantee that they would actually be taken seriously. Partly because winning a war gives a much more concrete and tangible sense, both of what the rubble is and who the enemy is, than simply going through a crisis. You need more imagination to deal with the crisis than to deal with the consequences of a global war. I would argue normatively, and I could justify this in ways that perhaps might convince at least some of you, that the idea of a space for deliberate action in the service of peace and solidarity at the global level is still a set of values that deserve subscription, and that it is possible both to defend those values and to provide a basis for acting in response to those values. Let's keep that for the discussion. And let's beware also of repetition as farce, to borrow a famous image from Karl Marx. If everything happens twice, once tragedy, once as farce, you have to be careful not to fall into a farce of trying to recreate the conditions of 1945 when the structural environment is no longer there. If there is a farce of peace and solidarity in our late period, it's probably professional sport. FIFA is the repetition as farce of the founding principles of the UN. So we should look with interest at the way in which the farcical character of what's happened in FIFA over the past few years gives a cautionary tale of how we should be careful not to try simply to replicate. Whatever we produce now will need to be genuinely new. Otherwise, it won't work. Not because Karl Marx's famous dictum about the second Napoleon le Petit, as Victor Hugo, who hated him just as much as Karl Marx did, termed him. It's not a universal eternal truth. But because of the way in which history is appropriated reflexively by actors who seek to present themselves as replicating something that happened previously for their own benefit, of course, and because they think it's the right thing to do, the element of farce is built into the reflexive appropriation. So let's be very careful about trying to reflexively appropriate the spirit of 1945 in order to rebuild today. What we need is the spirit of 2020, not reducing it to the pandemic, as I said earlier. Which leads me to the fourth question and the final question, which I will leave hanging as a conclusion to this lecture, which has already been as long as it needs to be. What to destroy to make space? In other words, what would a revolutionary project look like today? Because any project that deliberately destroys in order to make space for something new is, by definition, a revolutionary project, for better, for worse. In the same way that 1945 was a revolutionary project, but that didn't really have to destroy things because they had already been destroyed. We live in a more cluttered world, a world where we're more concerned to preserve things than to destroy them, a world in which you could almost argue that there is too much. Even within the UN system, 57 separate entities. Do we need that many? But none of them ever get closed down, do they? I'm not suggesting any should be closed down. I'm just raising the question, how do you justify the particular institutional arrangements? At some point, some things, in order to create space for novelty, will need to be destroyed deliberately, in a nice way, not destroyed in a purely negative way. Destroyed because they have served their purpose, can be given a nice send-off, burial with all the honors, as one says, in order to create space for something new. But of course, for that, there would need to be some agreement on what fundamentally new things might be desirable. And on this, I would be very pleased to have a dialogue with you. I have no brilliant idea on what new things might be desirable. But I do know that incrementalism, trying to make the world a better place with all the baggage, at some point becomes impossible. The stairs are too steep. We've all tried to climb steep stairs with 2 suitcases, right? You can't do it. At some point, one of the suitcases has to be left behind. Of course, when you're on holiday, you take one up first and then come back for the second. But history doesn't work that way. It doesn't give you the opportunity to come back for the other suitcase. And as a joke, I'm culturally obliged to make jokes when I make presentations. It comes from being born English. There is, if you're familiar with the work of Douglas Adams, you know that the question when and when not to go back for one's handbag is absolutely central to the late stages of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And we never know exactly when to go back and when not to go back. That is ultimately the non-intellectual, very trivial way of putting our current challenge. Should we go back for our handbag or not? What do you think? Thank you for listening to me for 55 minutes on Zoom, which is a challenge. And I'm really delighted to have some time to dialogue with you on what you might have thought of some of the ideas I've been throwing out. Thank you.
John, thank you very much for this, as we already are accustomed, brilliant lecture in brilliant English. And very provoking thoughts, very provoking new discussions. And really is a point of view that the crisis should not be considered as a negative phenomenon only. It might have a positive role. As Joseph Schumpeter has put it, as a creative destruction, just to clean place for some new development, some new vision of the world, which many say will not be after this crisis the same it was before. Anyway, if you permit, because there are 155 people at this platform at the moment, if you permit some questions to you, I don't know to what extent your time permits it.
My time permits, and it will be a great pleasure to discuss.
Anyway, we are very grateful to you for this lecture. It is the platform, the scientific platform, which closes the whole Congress. It is actually the last, let us say, point which has been put by you. in our Congress story, which we discussed today, is could be seen as a very successful one. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So any questions, please?
You know, you have this system of raising your hand, which is convenient. Otherwise, it's difficult to take the floor. If you're not familiar with it, if you click on participants, you will see at the bottom right of your screen, raise the hand. And I see someone's already done it.
Yeah. John, I would like to thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I don't think even that it is a lecture. This is a thinking which you have presented for us and which, let's say, stimulate us for understanding what is the future and what we have to do for the future. And I think that the work which has been done by the preparation of the globalistic Congress and the opportunities for us to meet in this very uneasy situation, I think this is very important element proving that the people have to think over what we have to do in coming future, because it will demand from us a substantial proposals for the changing of the societies, for the changing of the managers, for the changing of the approaches towards the education, because a lot of things which we can construct, we can do it only by preparing the people to think in the common way. Unfortunately, today we see that there is a very big divergence in this process. And what we have to do, this is to continue this dialogue, this discussion. And here I think that I can, let's say, correct Yuri, this is not the end of the Congress, this is just a comma in our work. And we, I think, have a summer task to think over what we have been discussing here, or to think over all the questions which have been raised. And in autumn, I think that we have to come back, taking into consideration that the situation maybe will become a bit more clear to what extent the pandemic has influenced the thinking in the world, and to what extent we can change the world after this pandemic. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation.
Thank you for your generous comments. Let me add maybe one point of a procedural nature, because you very correctly reminded us that the objective is to keep this Congress going as an ongoing discussion, which is that, as those of you who attended the special session on Tuesday know, one of UNESCO's challenges at the moment, something that the Director General is personally committed to, is to strengthen UNESCO as a laboratory of ideas. UNESCO has always claimed to be a laboratory of ideas, but we really need to make it real in light not just of the pandemic, as I explained, but of everything that the pandemic reveals. So we are very keen to listen to you all with your different disciplinary, geographical backgrounds, different perspectives on these issues, in order to understand first how we can make such a laboratory of ideas work, and secondly, what ideas we can put into the laboratory to try to produce what. And in that respect, I'd be delighted, as you suggest, Professor Kamyshanov, to continue the dialogue towards hopefully the next milestone in October, with a view to offering some answers to both of those questions. How can we make this work, and what ideas should we be putting into it? Comments on both of those questions are very, very welcome. I think Dr. Sharma is asking for the floor.
Yeah, good evening, sir. It's in India, it's around 7 p.m. Nice to meet you again. So we were together in 2017. I would like to ask one question, that now we had seen that in this COVID-19 situation, though we are far apart, but because of this technology, we are altogether. My question specific to you is how we will see the future of UNESCO, that it can bring more peace and prosperity in the world. Second, how we will be able to how we will be able to resolve the conflicts which is coming up because of the tensions between two superpowers. So what would be the role of UNESCO in bringing the peace between two superpowers? Thank you.
Good question. Not easy to answer. UNESCO is not a security agency in the geopolitical sense. There are other parts of the UN system that have that function. The idea on which UNESCO was founded, and which I think it has often performed well in respect of over the years, is the following. The geopolitical tensions are always mediated by forms of solidarity which are embedded in professional communities of various kinds. Communities of scientists, artists, writers, cultural practitioners, educational specialists. In other specialized agencies of the UN, health specialists and others. And that by creating more or less depoliticized platforms for technical specialists to meet around their technical agendas, it is possible to contribute to forms of solidarity that can trickle up, not down in this case. This is trickle up diplomacy, not trickle down economics, can trickle up into a feeling of commonality that can be shared even at the geopolitical level. During the Cold War, UNESCO's role in this respect is very well known in areas such as physics. And the question is whether, first, the kinds of problems we have today are of the same nature. Secondly, whether institutions such as UNESCO are still offering valuable solutions. And third, whether those solutions are powerful enough to make a difference. And in that respect, on the second and third questions, I will make no comment now. On the first question, I would point to a possible difficulty. In 1951, when UNESCO created simultaneously the International Social Science Council and the International Council for Philosophy and Humanistic Sciences, there was a vacuum in those two areas, a complete vacuum. There was no international global mechanism for specialists in the social sciences and the humanities to meet across geopolitical barriers as specialists in whatever they happen to be specialists in, anthropology, history, literary studies, musicology, or whatever. Creating mechanisms for meetings across geopolitical barriers proved incredibly productive, first in terms of restructuring the basis for international science cooperation. The International Science Council, which pre-existed the Second World War, had the same challenges at the same time, but it was more about reinventing an institution that already existed. UNESCO was very much involved as a partner, but didn't explicitly create a new institution at the time. In addition, there is at least some feeling, which can be backed up by some of the history, that creating those mechanisms for technical exchange also did filter up into the governmental sphere through, among other things, the role as experts within governmental structures of social scientists and humanists in ways that contributed to dialogue between states across geopolitical divisions. The question is whether that's still possible today. And of course, in a world where the globalization of science no longer needs global institutions, it's not obvious that that way of doing things can be replicated. The current pandemic is a good example. There's a lot of debate about the role of the World Health Organization. But what's very interesting is that, put to one side those debates about WHO as a specialized agency of the UN, and look at the ways in which scientists have been sharing information during the pandemic directly using social media. And I'm sure many of you have seen this as I have. Doctors in one country just calling on Twitter for clinical experience that they could rely on and getting it from doctors in other countries. people they'd never met, people whose opinions were not being filtered through the kinds of representative bodies that the UN system is good at creating, ideas that perhaps had not been properly validated. So like there are difficulties about the speed of scientific exchange in this context, but still a level of circulation that in some ways has been extraordinarily productive, particularly with regard to clinical protocols, but also with regard to genetic analysis of the virus itself, and to the extraordinarily rapid process of starting experimentation on various possible options for vaccination. And you know that there are many different ways of designing a vaccine, and basically all of them at the biomedical level are currently being experimented somewhere. But if the global institutions can simply be bypassed by direct relations between individuals, what does that mean for the global system? That question, I think, deserves reflection.
Thank you. Some more questions, please.
Yep, we have a request for the floor from Robert Harrop.
Dr. Kроули, thank you very much for your lecture. And I'd like to thank Yuri Sayamov as well for the invitation to be involved in this lecture. Thank you very much. My question, I was interested in your comments about the Sustainable Development Goals and how you talked about them being unpalatable for some audiences or some participants around the world. And I wondered, I mean, I realized that your 4 points give a very interesting process of looking at the rubble that we're facing at the moment. But I wondered if you could give some points about what, given the immediacy of the problems around the Sustainable Development Goals, if you could make some suggestions about how to make them more palatable in the present climate.
Good question. To answer it would require a judgment that I'm not confident in making as to whether the rejection is mainly about the values or mainly about the mechanisms. If you look at the US, for instance, where hostility to the UN system is significant in a certain fraction of the population, a very politically active fraction of the population, it's not always easy to tell whether what is being rejected is the very idea of global solidarity or the specific mechanisms of the United Nations and other mechanisms that have been developed to try to implement it. Hostility to the second is undoubted, and it's virulent. On the first point, I'm not entirely sure. I think more study would be required in that respect. In Europe, in countries like France or the UK, the position is similar, but I think the fraction of the population who subscribes to those kinds of theses is perhaps somewhat lower. But if you look at it in terms of national politics, the UN doesn't loom as large in national politics in either the UK or France. Many of the characteristic divisions of the recent period, which are very similar between the two countries, are divisions between basically forms of populism on both political wings versus technocratic centralism or centrism in the middle, centrism rather than centralism. Obviously, the current phases of the two countries are different. The current UK Prime Minister is the face of one version of populism, whereas the current President of France is the face of one version of technocratic centrism. But the polarities are similar, even if the current political configurations are opposite. And many of the issues, even if they're not focused on the global system, are actually similar in nature to those that drive opposition in the US to the global system as such. And my instinct as a political scientist, based on what data I've consulted, is that it's not just about the mechanisms, it is also about the values. And the way this has been constructed quite successfully by political entrepreneurs in various parts of the political spectrum is as an opposition between nationalism and globalism. This was developed by a French political scientist into the supposed opposition between people from somewhere and people from nowhere, which was a phrase used by a politician and then worked up into a social theory. The idea that globalism is the worldview of people from nowhere, meaning nowhere in particular, people who are unrooted, people who have multiple homes, people for whom travel is an essential part of their personal identity, people who are proud of the fact that they don't feel an overriding attachment to one particular state, and people from somewhere who do feel such an overriding attraction, is ultimately what drives hostility to the idea of a global order that is defined mainly by, on the one hand, the abstract value of global solidarity, and on the other hand, a series of technocratic structures that are designed to achieve it on the basis of some idea of abstract competence. That is what's being rejected. We've had enough of experts, to use one of the characteristic slogans of the Brexit process. And my feeling, I wouldn't call it more than a feeling, though I think it is backed by quite a lot of the research that does exist, but it's not research I've done myself. I don't get the chance to do that now that I'm a UN official, is that this is a structural divide that goes deep, that is embedded in social geography, in modes of polarization, including social media-driven polarization, and that we will be living with that opposition for a long time. And it's an opposition that's not entirely new, but that goes against the grain of the modes of political polarization that were characteristic of the earlier phase of political development in Western Europe and North America up to the 1980s, which drew different lines in different places and divided groups of people in different ways. I'm aware that that's heavy on waffling around your question and low on directly answering it. I'm not sure I can do any better at this stage. But yes, I do think these tensions are real. And I do think they have consequences for the capacity of the UN system to legitimize itself through the sincere commitment of national governments, who of course have in turn to legitimize their support for the UN within their national political systems. There'll be a very interesting empirical test, and it will come very soon. It will come in the 2021 budget cycle. The UN system hasn't been badly hurt by the crisis so far, because budgetary commitments had already been made to it, and its staff have been largely protected by their statutory conditions and by budget stability. But in 2021, when governments will need to start paying for all the money they've thrown around in 2020, and even with negative interest rates, you still have to repay the principal, the UN system will be asked to tighten its belt. The question is how much, and with what kinds of arguments. My suspicion, only suspicion, is that we'll be asked to do some pretty drastic belt tightening with arguments that will be basically anti-globalist in tone. No reason why you, the global elite, should be protected when ordinary people are suffering. And that will play very well at national level in many countries. Let's see if I'm right or wrong. And we'll know probably by about January 2021.
John, I think no worry about it, because you are always welcome in the Moscow University. And I use this possibility to say hello to our friend Carlos, who appeared on the screen. Carlos, hello.
Hello everybody. Good to see you again.
Hi, Carlos.
So yeah, I arrived late to your talk. Sorry for that, John, but
No, it's
But
my
I
fault.
heard-
I gave you the wrong time. No excuse. I don't know why I mixed the time up, but I told you 3:30 and it wasn't 3:30.
No problem, because I heard enough to congratulate you for it. I mean, for your provoking thoughts, and I want to profit from the occasion. To ask a question, or maybe more make a comment around this question on the role of institutions and how, if they are good at transforming and themselves, or we have to get rid from them, you know, which in my view is very much related to epistemology, to the way we understand, how we understand reality, and the gap between the advances that we have had in science, in many scientific disciplines, about the limitations of conventional paradigms. Classical mechanics is the best example. In physics today, of course, any physicist will say, well, classical mechanics is a paradigm which works well in a certain domain of applicability, but there are many other domains in which that does not work, right? We have not done, for reasons which are not easy to fully understand, we have not done the same job in other disciplines of not getting rid, but accepting that a certain paradigm is only applicable for a certain type of situations. And we are going on with the paradigm of classical mechanics in the organization of our social life. So just for instance, you mentioned, well, the UN system has 57 entities, and it's you see that in our governments organized, we tend to split reality into smaller pieces, into ministries, into departments, and each department has to deal with one particular issue, while all issues, and the characteristic of complexity is interdependency. So all issues are interdependent. And then we have a real issue trying to deal with piecemeal solutions, while all the issues are interconnected and interdependent. But the point is that some institutions have been able to learn. I mean, we have now more or less, we have now had more or less 70 years, at least, of systems thinking. So what I'm saying about this, about interdependency, complexity, etc., is not new at all. It has been analyzed by many thinkers since the 30s, the 40s, the 50s of past century. And many ideas have come out of that, and among them the idea that, well, institutions may evolve, complex systems may evolve, but they don't evolve the way we want them to evolve, you know, in the domain of sustainability, in the Club of Rome, which I'm of, but also in the general, in the domain of sustainability, we recognize complexity. And a second later, we want a linear and pretty straightforward solution, you know? We have all the time this paradox. Yeah, the world is complex. Let's find out a clear vision of where we want to go and a clear pathway forward to that place. You know, well, it doesn't work that way. Complex systems learn new patterns. They don't change because from outside, and we are not outside, somebody from outside decides you have to change in that direction. But the point is that some organizations have been able to at least draw conclusions from all these findings of systems thinking and cybernetics and all these disciplines. And that's the private corporations. So the history of the evolution of these disciplines is also, and I think I would say regretfully, the fact that they have been heard. Systems thinkers have been heard more by private organizations in the world, which to a certain extent have learned, and I've learned how to learn based on those ideas. And if you look at the evolution of the production of ideas in the field of complexity thinking. A lot of that has been in the field of organizational management, basically because they had more opportunities to get paid by somebody, you know, to do their research, and that somebody was typically private organizations trying to understand how to be best in what they do by absorbing that knowledge. That hasn't happened, as far as I am aware, in the domain of public administrations and multilateral institutions. And I'm not sure to understand why it didn't happen. And I'm still optimistic that it could happen in the future, which would be a sort of way out of keeping everything as it is, which is not an option, as you put very well. But not, I mean, the other scenario being getting rid of the institutions we have. My question is, well, will that happen, and to what, into what will we get if we do that? You know, because there are many temptations to get rid of the institutions we have for bad reasons, or what I consider bad reasons. And so in the middle of that, there could be the pathway of let's the institutions which exist learn from all these incredible amount of knowledge acquired about complexity, complex systems, cybernetics, and so. But it hasn't happened, at least yet. So just wanted to share this with you, and of course I'm happy to hear what is your thinking about that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question, and my thinking would be a whole other lecture. So let me try to summarize very, very simply. At the core of the answer lies, I think, failure of new public management, another hugely influential idea from the 1990s, which was the idea that by changing the management principles of the public sector, you could produce the valuable features of the private sector within the public sector. And this has worked very badly. The university has been one of the most characteristic guinea pigs of new public management in the public sector. And it has produced some very perverse consequences, including, of course, the ever increasing ratio of academic managers to academics actually teaching and doing research, which is characteristic of universities everywhere. And of course, the managers are much better paid than the academics who actually do the work. And academics complain constantly about this. The idea that there's something called market discipline that can be introduced in the public sector and will produce the same effects in the public sector as in the private sector hasn't worked for two reasons. First, because it hasn't been implemented sincerely. Anyone who hasn't read David Lodge's 1984 novel, Nice Work, should reread it. Yeah. It's all about this.
Yeah.
And Lodge is a very acute commentator on these issues. For those of you who don't know the novel, it's the rather improbable love story between an industrial manager and a postmodernist feminist literary academic in Birmingham in the 1980s. And the industrial manager at one point makes a very surprising intervention when he's invited to attend a departmental council in the university. And the departmental council is going on about how it's going to produce market-based incentives for academic productivity. And they expect the industrial manager to applaud and say, this is great, and this is exactly what you should be doing. And he says exactly the opposite. He says, you are playing at market discipline, but there's actually no market and no discipline. And by playing at it, you will produce, predictably, toys, not real change. The only way, in other words, market discipline doesn't work through discipline. It works through creative destruction, as Yuri said earlier, quoting Schumpeter, who on this point was absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
And creative destruction is an evolutionary process. There's no way of predicting in advance who will survive. The point is that differential survival drives systemically positive change. And those who survive are not those who deserve to survive, they're those who actually survive. It's a self-referential process. Of course, there's a whole history of social Darwinism trying to moralize survival, differential survival. Herbert Spencer's phrase, the survival of the fittest, was a slightly desperate attempt to say that those who survive deserve to survive. But of course, if you're a real Darwinian, the answer is rubbish. Those who survive, survive. End of story. They don't deserve it. There's no difference between luck and merit. Interestingly, a point also made by John Rawls in his theory of justice, but that will be a whole other discussion. The attempt to apply new public management was primarily ideological. It was based on admiration for the private sector by people who knew nothing about the private sector. And as a result, they picked up on the wrong features of the private sector and ended up creating in the public sector the worst of all possible worlds. All the sclerosis and timidity of the public sector combined with all the brutality and PowerPoint thinking of the private sector. Whereas what's good about the private sector is not PowerPoint thinking, it's the opposite. PowerPoint thinking is what gets in the way in the private sector as well. In order to get out of this set of traps, you would have to take the evolutionary metaphors seriously. But that would involve giving public institutions the opportunity to fail, the opportunity to define themselves, the opportunity to split and spin off. And the public sector has none of those things. And it's very interesting how this turns up in UNESCO. I don't know how many UNESCO colleagues are on the line, but they will recognize this. In an organization like UNESCO that runs through the whole UN system, one of the first questions people ask, including our member states and the governing bodies, is, does UNESCO have a mandate for this? But once you ask that question and take it seriously, you can forget any private sector evolutionary process. If your existence is defined by your mandate, then you are locked into a basically an engineered process. Mm-hmm. The analog of which is mechanistic design, not evolutionary emergence. If you want evolutionary emergence, you have to drop mandates. There was an interesting article in The Economist a couple of years ago, which was comparing the survival of different institutions. And it compared two institutions in a quite interesting way. It compared the Carnegie Endowment for Peace with IBM. The point being that the Carnegie Endowment for Peace has a mandate. It has a purpose written into its founding articles. It's to do a certain thing, which means that it can only succeed or fail in doing that thing. It can't invent for itself a radically new purpose, no more than UNESCO can. IBM has reinvented itself 3 times. Fundamentally and very radically, from essentially a builder of business machines, the original meaning of the word, to a supplier of comprehensive computing services to large corporations, to a primarily consulting company, the basic principle of which is to help people understand how to use technology. And each of those 2 turning points in the 3 successive existences of IBM has flirted with bankruptcy. It's worth thinking about. The ability to reinvent oneself implies that you can reinvent your purpose. You can't do that in the public sector. I don't know what to conclude from that, but I do know that, like Vic, the character in Nice Work, we need to say very clearly every time we discuss the future of the public sector in the face of private sector techniques and protocols, if you do it, you have to do it seriously. Don't play at being entrepreneurial.
Thank you, John. I think we already took a lot of your time, and really you have provoked with your lecture a lot of questions. It was a very, as I said already, thought-provoking material, and let us think it over a little bit during the second phase of the Congress, which will be through the summer. And maybe we shall organize under your auspices another round of discussions. Anyway, what happened today, thanks to your devotion and your agreement to give this lecture, it is, in my opinion, the first ever held Global UNESCO lecture and the first ever held Global UNESCO online school. And I would like to congratulate you for it. Thank you very much for it. And I would like to thank also all participants in this event, which is finalizing the summer session of the Congress, which was, as you know, in the online form. On one hand, of course, it is a pity that we could not be close to each other and embrace each other, but on the other one, it has helped us to involve more people from all coins of the world, to make them join our platform. For us, it was a very good experience, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank again, first of all, UNESCO, who was very much involved in this Congress. I would like to thank especially the Assistant Director General, Professor Stefania Giannini, for her speech she gave at the opening of the forum. I would like to thank very much Dr. Crowley for all he did for the success this session on most and the Congress in total was. I would like to thank UNESCO Director Angela Mello, who followed our story, all the colleagues from UNESCO, and I would like to thank also the World Academy of Art and Science, its president, Dr. Gary Jacobs, other colleagues, and I would like to thank also the Club of Rome, co-president Mampela Rampele, and Carlos, who is present at the moment, for their involvement. And I think that the efforts undertaken were not in vain, because we made a very important junction. It is Moscow State University, it is UNESCO, it is Academy, it is Club of Rome. We can continue working together, composing joint projects, elaborating ideas to be included in the next midterm plan of UNESCO for 2022-2029. And in this sense, I think we have a lot to do still. A big work is in front of us, but it is a work of intellect, it is a work of our brain, and it is a work for, as we put it, for the forum of May 20, it is the work for civilization prospects and the future of the humankind. Thank you once again, everybody, and I hope we shall meet soon, be it online, be it offline, be it in Moscow, in Paris, maybe in India, I don't know, in Spain or somewhere in our big and so small and fragile world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much, sir.
Thank you for excellent organization of all these events, and thank you so much for the partnership with UNESCO, which we value greatly.
Thank you. Thank you, and hello
Thank
to
you so much.
a lot of
Goodbye.
health, above all, no virus, good mood, a lot of happiness and love to everybody.
Thank you. The same to you
Thank you.
and to everybody.
Goodbye
to all.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.
Bye bye.
Looking forward to